We have a few speakers with us today from NHM who are going to talk to us about the DiSSCo kind of system and for georeferencing and teach us all something that we all want to learn. Many of us work with historic collections and we're familiar with problems about kind of information on the label being a bit unclear or opaque, whether that's poor handwriting, old locality names that aren't used and stuff. And basically we're looking more into digitization, all of us now, and providing kind of access to our collections and collection localities. And this team at the Natural History Museum work on the distributed system of scientific collections, which is DiSSCo for short project, and they're going to give us some tools on how we can kind of get started on that in our own collections. So we're going to talk about what georeferencing is, why it's important, what tools are available to people, look at some case studies, and looking at where it's possible, where it's probably not possible, why that is, and why it can be difficult in some cases. So there's going to be a mix of talks with a number of speakers across the day. We're going to start out in the morning with Krisztina Lohonya, who is going to do an introduction to georeferencing. And we'll have hopefully a tea break around 11:05 for about 15 minutes. So just so people have that in their head, they know when their next break is. So in terms of the speakers we've got Krisztina, as I said, she's got several years experience in digitization of natural history collections, including recuration, databasing, photography, transcription, and georeferencing. And she's got a particular interest in transcription and georeferencing with extended experience working on East Asian collections. Hilary Warner is NHM Senior Data Manager focusing on collections data and collections management software. Her previous experience is in applied ecology, entomology, and curation. We've also got Malcolm Penn here. Malcolm is the GIS Manager Specialist at the NHM in London, and he is an established academic researcher who has expertise in the fields of geographic information systems, or GIS, modelling, remote sensing, systematics, microvariation of soils and plants in tropical environments, vegetation classifications, GIS ecological monitoring and conservation, georeferencing natural history collections, biodiversity monitoring, and geostatistics. And we also have another person with us who Krisztina is going to introduce now, another member of their team.
Hi, everyone. I hope you will find this workshop today interesting and enjoyable and maybe useful. The mornings are kind of going to cover presentations from all three of us, and in the afternoon, I was hoping to have kind of like an open discussion format where we can discuss things that came up as questions or discussions in the morning, and topics that we want to discuss. And I prepared a couple of slides of like case studies of interesting georeferencing cases and labels. So we can just go through and we can discuss how I went about and what are the limitations of georeferencing certain labels. So the speakers were introduced by Emma, and we are going to also have my colleague Louise in the chat helping and providing resources. I prepared a GitHub repository, but I am not that familiar with GitHub. And if you are also not, I also prepared a Google Sheet, which I'm planning to continuously update in the future with georeferencing resources. And my colleague Louise will provide links to these, and she will also answer chat questions if it's a quick answer, and she's confident answering those. But feel free to pop questions in the chat, and I think I planned questions for after most of the talks. Louise has a very good long experience of georeferencing and transcription with me, with particular expertise in Alfred Edwin Eaton's labels, which if you ever come across labels from that person, he was a British entomologist, and he is one of the top person on my list of people with atrocious handwriting. So I truly find it a super skill that she's familiar with his labels and locations that he visited. And shall we start?
Yeah, off you go. You're free to share your screen there. Thanks so much.
Share and share screen. Yeah. Sorry, just I'm trying to figure out why my taskbar is showing. Because it's going to cut off labels. Maybe it's better if I share the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, everyone, I'm not familiar that much with using Zoom. Yeah, it's better. Okay. Good. Oh, that's not the first one. Sorry. So the first talk, I'm just going to talk about generally on georeferencing, what georeferencing is, what are the limitations, how do we usually go about, and what are limitations to it. So I have a couple of case studies that I'm going to show us something like a particular situation that can compromise georeferencing efforts. And I will show a couple of case studies as well, where what happens if something doesn't go to plan in terms of like making mistakes and what's the kind of the long-term results of making mistakes. My slides will be available after the talk. I have a fixture link here, and my colleague can also share the fixture links in chat, and the slides will be available after the end of today's workshop to view and download. So what georeferencing is, I grabbed kind of I forgot the word, kind of the definition, yes, sorry, temporary brain freeze. I grabbed the definition from the IDIG-BO website, but generally, georeferencing is a process of determining geographic coordinates for a location, which is usually presented on our label, essentially to putting our specimens in our collections on the map and building a database with these points on the map and essentially providing a data set for further research. It can also help connecting collections from various institutes or various parts of the museum geographically. We can also connect collections together that were collected by the same person. So georeferencing essentially kind of grouping collections together that might be housed in different institutes. And it also provides a lot of data points for further research for historians, for natural historians and scientists. These coordinates that we are determining usually include an uncertainty radius around the chosen point. And that's because, as you will see on my slides, there are limitations how precise coordinates we can assign to our labels. Sometimes it's going to be very vague, covering a large area. If we don't have much data, sometimes we can go very precise. It really depends on not only the label, but it also that how history affected that particular area. Because sometimes, even if our label is very detailed, we won't be able to find exact coordinates due to historical or geographical changes, which I will show you some examples throughout the talk. So looking at specimens and georeferencing how to go about, the primary data that we associated with our specimen is what's on the label. And ideally, these are what the specimen is, who collected it, when it was collected, and where it was collected. In terms of georeferencing and finding coordinates, you think that the where is kind of the information that we are looking for. But in terms of historical collections, you shouldn't treat the location as its own entity. It always should be used in context with the rest of the information on the label. And sometimes you can get like very modern and very good labels with all the information present, like you can see on that very large and detailed label on the bottom right, which even includes coordinates, elevation, detailed description of the place, habitat information. But if you're working with natural history collections or even like any kind of museum and historical collection, you know that this is not always the case. And unfortunately, the longer you go back, the less information is usually available. For example, you can see two labels on the top, which has very limited information, maybe just having pretty much the last name of the person, essentially a country and the year. And this is the primary information you have available. Depending on like how much resources you have available, and also what kind of project you're running, how much time do you have to dedicate to each label, you can always do further research and try to identify more information, but there are limitations to each project. For example, in NHM, before we are starting any digitization project, there are set guidelines and discussions that we have to talk about, like what is included in the project, what is the time frame of the project. Because I can tell you that you can whiz through and transcribe and maybe put like an approximate geographical designation to your specimen, or you can spend hours trying to find one location. So you really need to take into account like how much time do you have, what's the size of your collection, and how much time you are going to dedicate to each label. Is there a workflow that you think that you can implement that there are limits how much time you should spend on one label and then just move on to the next one and maybe come back later to a problematic label if you have more time later. And then when we have this primary information, we can try to find resources to have extended specimens. This is not only to the specimen itself, it can be molecular data analysis, the DNA analysis, but it also can mean that you are finding field notes, publications, expedition notes, which you can always attach to your specimen because they are sort of related in the broader sense. As I mentioned that sometimes when your label has limited information, you can have additional resources to look into to find more information. In terms of botanical collections, I usually try to locate duplicate specimens because ideally they are the same specimen. And usually if you have duplicate specimens, some of the labels are in better condition. It could be that the place where it was housed or anything could have happened to the label. It could have water damage, insect damage, anything. In terms of, for example, NHM labels, sometimes we have labels that were burned and partially burned, and I'm trying to locate a duplicate specimen because the museum got hit during the Second World War and the herbarium was hit. So some of the labels were burned, some of them destroyed, and it's crucial that we find duplicate specimens to identify collection information. And if your collection is not one of those types where duplicate specimens are something to find, like entomological collections or other specimens, you can always try and look for other specimens collected by the same collector, and maybe around the same time that will help you identify more information about your specimen. Or it could be that you're just looking for more labels written by the same person because you have trouble identifying the handwriting. The most common websites I go for that are JSTOR Global Plans for the type collections. I'm usually using Bionomia for finding specimens from the same collectors and finding out what institutes holds their specimens. Herbaria United is a very good resource for looking up British collectors, place names, and digitized British specimens. but individual museum data portals are equally good resource. More and more museums are putting out their collections for us to find. So this is an example that I like to include in my presentations, because it's one of those labels where you kind of need a lot of background information. You can identify, it's not an easy read, but eventually you can get used to it. It's from a particular collector called Delaunay. He was Père Jean-Marie Delaunay, a French missionary and explorer and botanist. He was extensively collecting in China. So if you already have background information and live dates, it can help you identify and narrow down your location, even if your label may not look kind of like an idea and it's a little bit more difficult to read. But Delaunay's labels are also a very good example of what to do in a situation when you have collection from a country that's using a different writing system. So to help identifying the location, you kind of need to know who your collector was, what their mother tongue was, how they were writing their label, when they lived, because these would all determine how they were writing down Chinese names on their labels. And this is another label as well, which the handwriting is beautiful. I absolutely love Hans's labels. So this is from the herbarium of Henry Fletcher Hans, who was a vice consul in China, a British vice consul in the 19th century. And I particularly like his labels. But some of them is rather difficult to find. He's using very old names that sometimes you can or cannot find them with old spellings that are not used anymore. So for example, Whampoa Danes Island, that is currently called Chuangzhou Island in Guangzhou in Guangdong province. So if you don't have that information and you don't know where to start, it's rather difficult to find the location. There are several methods to do georeferencing. There are tools and software available as well to help you out in your quest of identifying locations. One of these tools is GeoPic, which I think it was developed last year or the year before. It's a very good resource of finding locations. You can see that from the previous label, Danes Island is in their data set, and it will take you to the location with coordinates and uncertainty and all the other information that you need. But these kind of tools have limitations. As you see, some of our labels, it is useful for locations that may be more known, so you don't have to individually look for uncertainty and coordinates. But it's rather difficult if your place just doesn't exist anymore, which unfortunately the case in a lot of times. And now I'm gonna include a couple of examples. Manual georeferencing, I usually mean by that you have to do a little bit more digging, and it's not that there is a software or a tool that's available for you to use. It's more, you have to dig through maybe 200-year-old presentations in various languages, in various quality of scans, locations, and dig through a lot of maps from the time. Some of them is easier, some of them is more difficult. So this particular one is one of the easier one because it's a relatively recent one. It's from 1996, and I work with a lot of 18th and 19th century specimens. So for me, 1996 is a recent specimen that even includes coordinates, which is quite handy. But you can see from the minutes that it's not going to be a very precise location. If we go on Google Maps and we put in the coordinates, it will take us to this place, which is a relatively correct place, but the radius should be wider around it because we don't have very precise information. It specifies the county and the further administrative section under it, and but it also says that just south of Chumda, which is not that precise of a designation. Chumda is around this level. further down the map. And that's the river that they're mentioning. So there is a little bit of variability where this place could be. Of course, extra habitat information, if it's available in your label, that's always helpful. Kind of looking at satellite maps and terrain maps to kind of narrow down the location from your label. But more often than not, you're going to find labels that doesn't have coordinates and have very limited information of the location. And for example, with these, it's easier to find Herringswell in Suffolk and Foxendown in Moffen still exist and still there. But when you're thinking of uncertainty, you have to take into account that you don't know what the person meant when they were writing down this location. In terms of Herringswell, it's a designating of a village, but the uncertainty kind of helps you cover an entire area because we can't really go back to 1848 and ask the person, does it mean that they were collecting the specimen within the settlement's borders, maybe in the middle of it, or does it mean that they were venturing out and collecting around the border, or does it mean that for them a 15-20 minutes walk from the settlement is still designating this as a location? So the uncertainty is kind of helping us signal how certain or uncertain we are of our coordinates and how good those coordinates are. And going back to these that I wanted to mention as well, that one thing that you always have to consider when working with historical collections, that just because a settlement exists on your map, that doesn't mean that is the same as it was. This label is from 1848. It's almost 200 years. We have to go back and look at maps and ordnance survey maps from the era to see if the settlement since then changed. It became bigger, smaller, and that would have also affect our radius around our chosen coordinates. For smaller settlements like these, the variability is usually less. But if you are thinking of like very large cities, like how London like expanded over the time, then it's rather difficult sometimes to determine where your coordinates should be. Sometimes we have labels that are indicating that they are just saying that it's in particular city and it's collected on the city wall, which usually they indicate the original historic city. But if you go around Europe, you all know that the city is usually expanded way over the original borders of the historic central. That was likely the city wall that the person meant. Sometimes as well, you need additional background information. And the problem usually I'm facing with transcription and georeferencing that you can only do so much training to cover everything and to kind of help people start georeferencing. Because this is one of those situations when the more you do it, the more experience you are gaining, the more background knowledge you are going to have. And you can have loads of resources available, but essentially what is going to speed up the transcription and the georeferencing when all of this knowledge is in your head readily available and you don't have to spend time looking up additional resources. And what is really handy is not only having this background information, but having a large team who has an experience on various different topics, collectors or geographic regions. So in cooperation, you don't have to remember everything because you're building a team who has individual expertise in particular niche areas, but together you kind of have the ability to crack all of your labels. So for example, the left label is from a collector that I see in databases often misinterpreted because on most of his labels, his name is written as R-P Mayer. And that I often see transcribed as first name and middle name. which in this particular case is not that. They stand for Reverend Pair. His full name is Edouard Ferdinand Ernest Pair. He was a French missionary and plant collector in China. He served as a pro-vicar apostolic of Yunnan province. And if you're making misinterpretations of your label, that can cause problems further down in your collection management system or in the data set you're building. Because if someone wants to focus on specimens from these particular collectors, they might miss out on specimens because in the system or in your data set, these would just indicate two different person as a collector. And if you don't have this background knowledge that this is the same person, you are missing out on specimens to look at if you want to research particular persons or particular areas. The label on the right-hand side is another example of when it's good to have background knowledge to identify the label. When we are digitizing our British and Irish collection in the Natural History Museum, we are recording vice counties for our specimens, especially at the beginning when we are assigning barcodes to the specimens. So we have kind of like a minimum information that makes your specimen findable in the collection and having like giving you a little bit of an outline of geographic coverage, even if it's not precise. But when you encounter a label like this, which says behind the Warren Ring Walden, it's rather difficult to find because when you're searching for it, you might get a lot of extra hits, which we encountered this one. And even if it says that it's a set of specimens, including many cited in Gibson's Flora of Essex, Essex is divided into two vice counties, so we need to still determine which vice county it belongs to. And in this case, we contacted the curator to help us out, where he mentioned that Walden just refers to saffron Walden, which he assumed that's the case here. And this is important here because if you're a collector as well, if you're collecting in an area where you're most familiar with, you live there, you collect there, you go there a lot, we humans tend to shorten the names that we are using for places, especially if it's something that in your notes you're going to be familiar with, people in your direct surroundings are going to familiar with, but you don't know where your collection is going to end up in 50 years time, 100 years time, 200 years time, and maybe that the inside background knowledge is lost. So cracking these kind of labels is the one where we are relying on background information, insider knowledge that someone has of a particular area or a particular set of labels. And as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes the problem that is caused for georeferencing is not that you don't have a good label available, it's more the problem of that your site for some reason doesn't exist anymore. It's very difficult to find. Some of these examples, as I mentioned, when the location doesn't exist anymore, it may be that it was a settlement that got abandoned and now it's a ghost town. And in certain cases of ghost towns, no houses exist anymore. Or there is something happened in history and the building that your collector thought it's gonna stand forever because it's already stood for 1,000 years, it's no more. And one of these examples is this pagoda that I grabbed from a book cover. This picture is from around between 1910 and 1923. The book was published in 1923. And this particular pagoda doesn't exist anymore because it was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution in China. So it's rather difficult to find because unlike in other places where the building still exists, and if I know the approximate location, I can just look through satellite images maybe to find it. In this particular case, I won't be able to because there is nothing to see. And considering that we have a very large amount of collection from the 19th century, and then especially in Europe, we had two world wars, you can imagine how many of your site from your labels doesn't exist anymore, or it changed significantly. The other example is when geographic features change. So this is an example of one of the islands from Tonga that got destroyed by a volcanic eruption. And this is not the only case. Volcanic eruption can happen. They can create new islands or destroy them. Rivers change courses and mountains erode. Glaciers are disappearing these days, which is all going to affect how successfully you can georeference your specimens. The other problem that I encounter most often is when borders change, and I always try to include different maps from different continents because we can use similar maps from Asia, Africa, America, Europe, that how much borders change and how rapidly they can change unexpectedly. So this is a map from during the First World War in Europe. And if you look in the Middle and Eastern Europe, you can see that these countries doesn't look like this anymore, or they don't even exist anymore. And we have a lot of new countries that didn't exist back then. And I will have a couple of examples why this is a problem, because people who lived in these countries and they're writing their labels, they didn't think their country is not going to exist anymore, it's going to change borders. And because of this, they would just write down that their label is from Germany. And if you are assigning a modern country designation with modern borders to your specimen, you are essentially excluding some of your possible collection locations that these days it's not part of that country anymore, but at the time your collector was collecting, it was. And I was thinking if I should include these or not, but I think most of us in the UK and in Europe have international collections and very different labels. And this is kind of like an additional next level problem that we encounter in our collections, when it's not only that the language your label is written on is not something that you're familiar with, but if it's in a writing system, is the same that your language is using, you can still sort of transcribe the label. But if it's written in a completely different writing system and you don't have experience in that writing system, then unfortunately you have very limited options to georeference your specimen if you can't even read it. If you are lucky and you can sort of identify a language, you might be able to find someone or contact someone who is familiar or a native speaker, maybe in your institute or in other institutes. But if you are unfamiliar with, sometimes the issue is that you don't even know where to start. I had a similar case when a curator contacted me recently, showing me a label that they just don't know where to start. And luckily for them, I recognized the writing system and I could suggest a person to contact because that person is very likely familiar with the handwriting of that particular language. And one thing a lot of people don't realize as well with other writing systems as well, that the same rules apply. Your printed letters are going to look different from your handwritten letters. It doesn't matter what writing system you are. Chinese characters written by a person who is a native in that language is going to look very different from how a letter is properly written in school settings or how it looks like in a printed format. And even in printed format, there are several fonts available for every language, which also changes the shape of the letters. So if you are not familiar or not that confident in that particular language, all of these things can throw you off in the wrong direction. And I included that you can use modern tools and translations, but I would always advise a level of caution, especially with AI tools these days, because how AI tools build at the moment is that if they are not familiar with it, they usually just make things up. And even if you're using like a traditional translation tool or like Google Translate, for example, there is the problem that we encounter with language, that every language has words that are the same spelling, but the context determines their meaning, and the algorithm or the translation tool might not be able to recognize what the context of your word is, especially because the labels that we are usually working with are not entire sentences and diary entries or novels where there's a lot of context. These are usually words thrown after each other, which makes it even harder to determine the correct context and the correct meaning of the word. These ones are just a set of labels that I thought it would be fun to include. One of the interesting things that you encounter is that you can see on the two slides I included that there is some translated locality here and here as well, but this one just designates Russia. But the Syriac label is a lot longer, and this is something that I encountered in a lot of our labels, that if your specimen was collected by a native person from that particular country and they wrote the label in their native language, those are always going to be longer and more detailed than the possible English translation they include. So it's best, even if you have an English version or a translated version of your location, you should always try and translate the original label from the original language for more details. And sometimes I particularly like in georeferencing that you encounter stories. You encounter expeditions that you can look up places and people and people's life. And my favorite thing in georeferencing is the human element. Then you discover certain things of your collector because they were the same humans as we are today, affected by your environment and your personal life. So you can see sometimes comments and notes on your labels, and usually there is a reason why something was written in a way it is. Sometimes is you have to use certain phrases and certain names for planes to not take political slides, and this is true for our collections as well. I encounter a lot of labels from the 19th century and sometimes even to early 20th century where the term they were using for an area is ancient and very archaic, that no one is using it for a while, but it was still included in the label. There could be various reasons for that. Maybe they just thought that that's the best designation. Maybe they didn't know if they cross border or not. But sometimes it also be that to avoid taking political sides as well, designating what the name of the country is they are in, especially if they are in a territory that is under border dispute. So this is one of the slides that has the most writing on it. And yes, as I mentioned before, especially with international collections, but even your own within your country's limits collections, always treat the label as a whole. Everything on your label is going to affect how successfully you can find your location. And I encountered a lot of errors, which I list a couple here, where common names were transcribed as locality because the person doing the transcription was unfamiliar. The collector's name and location was swapped, and this can really hinder your georeferencing efforts when you're trying to georeference a person instead of a location. And I've seen a lot as well, especially in East Asian collections, that the collector's first name and last name was swapped because the person doing the transcription was unfamiliar, that the name order is different in certain countries than the English or the Western version. And the most significant problem I encounter when dealing with transcription, transcribed data sets, that instead of verbatim transcription, the person who was doing the transcription interpreted it, and they interpreted it wrongly. And this is one of the things that I like to emphasize, that always include verbatim transcription, always use verbatim transcription, and if it's possible, have your label next to you to look at, and don't just rely already transcribed data sets, because you don't know what was the expertise of the person, what was their experience, who did the transcription. You don't know if they were familiar with the language and area or the person's handwriting or not. And if you're purely relying on like treating it as a correct data set, it can lead you to the wrong directions. So, sorry. These two labels are example to these. Both of these labels were filed in our China section, and the left one is from Turkey, and the right one is from Cyprus. For the left one, I can only assume that the one information that was taking the person to the wrong direction was Orient. A lot of people's mind, if you look at Orient, it refers to East Asia, or at least Asia, and not particularly just like still part of Europe. In this particular label, I think the collector's name was the one that was probably confusing the person who did the transcription. Synthesis can easily be misread as synensis, which would lead you to the China direction. This is an example when you have partial labels, and as I mentioned, you have to treat the label as a whole with additional information. Because the label just says Mount Buffalo for locality, and Victoria is not a place name that is very unique. You can find a lot of Victorias all around the world. And in this particular situation, we also know that it was collected by Tilliard in 1930. But even though we know that he lived in Australia, he traveled a lot to the US and all around the world to New Zealand. So it's could help us narrow it down, but it's really helpful to know what the specimen is, because you can just look at species distribution, and that usually help you determine at least which continent to look at. So this particular one was from Australia. This is an example that I wanted to include where I mentioned that mistakes can happen during transcription. The person may be unfamiliar and misreading the labels, especially if it's handwritten. Not many people are familiar these days with cursive handwriting. And this is one of those situations where I didn't have the label at hand, so I just went by the transcription, which was transcribed with an A instead of an E as on the label. So I had to look up the label because I kept looking for this particular, what did I do? Okay. This particular location, and all of the results I got when I was trying to georeference it led me to this province. So you can see that with one letter difference, you are already in a different Chinese province, and Chinese provinces are huge. So if you're only relying on the transcription and not looking at the label and just thinking that it must be correct, it can really hinder your georeferencing efforts. These are examples that I wanted to include, which is references to border changes, which is one of the most common issue that I found when doing georeferencing in historical collections. So, for example, the top label says Formosa in Monte Shinto, and if you're familiar with East Asian languages, it immediately stands out that this place name doesn't look Chinese, it looks Japanese. We know Formosa is the old name for Taiwan, but it still hinders when you're trying to find this place in a map, because you're not going to find the place under this name. This is where we treat the label as a whole. So we look at who the collector is, we look at what date the person did the collection, and that would give an indication why the name is in Japanese. In 1914, Taiwan was under Japanese occupation, and the Japanese changed every place name to a Japanese name. So in ideal situation, you can research additional field notes and maybe diaries from the person if you have available, or you can try to find a Taiwanese map from that time with the Japanese place names and trying to find that place name if you can, or at least the rough area where the specimen is probably from. Another good example is this particular label. It's written with Cyrillic letters. There is a translation with it. It's from Litvinov. So you would think that this particular place, it must be somewhere in Russia or maybe some of the ex-Soviet countries, but it is actually in China because it's from Manchuria and it's from the area which is currently belongs to China. And again, we have to take into account who our collector was and when the particular label was written. And this is also a very good example for that the original language is going to contain more information, because as you can see, the translated version just saying Manchuria and is designating the city where the specimen is collected. But if the Russian label information is translated, it also shows us that it's a railway station that we are looking for. So it's really helping us out to find a better coordinate for our specimen. And I only have a very few slides left. These are just examples where border changes are really affecting where you're filing your specimens. On this particular map, the highlighted area is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And for specimens that we have from this particular country, they often just say Austria or Hungary, which can be very misleading if you are just going by what your label says and attaching location in your collection management system, like at least putting in the country, and because it's very likely that it's not going to be the modern country borders. We have this particular label that you can see, it says in Ungarn, but it is actually from modern day Slovakia. We have this particular label which says Hungaria Meridionalis, which again, it is from modern day Serbia. And this particular one is technically impossible to find because it just says it's a coast of Austria. Currently, Austria doesn't have a coast, and this could very well refer to Italy, Slovenia, or Croatia. So you really have to use a coordinate that is just very not precise and have to use quite a large radius to cover the area where your specimen is likely from. This is an example of another like a historical region. The sort of highlighted area is Turkestan, which is a historical region in Central Asia. And we have quite a lot of specimens from here. And you can see the modern country borders in red, that your specimen can be from a lot of different countries. So this particular one is from China. The next one also saying Turkestania, it is from Uzbekistan, but very close to the Turkmenistan border. This particular one as well, it's from Turkmenistan. And the same situation applies here, where we have the same collector. Both of the labels are Turkestan, but one of them is from Kazakhstan and the other one is from China. So you really need to dig through a lot of extra publications, field notes, biography information, where the person traveled, expedition notes, ship logs sometimes, and also lots and lots of very old maps and trying to find your location. And that was my first presentation. I'm gonna, I think, stop sharing maybe. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, Krisztina, thank you so much. That was brilliant. It was great to see all the, yeah, we have a lot of labels like that, I know, in our collection anyway here in Dublin, where it's, sometimes it takes a team of people to decipher it, and even then it can be difficult.
Yes.
Thanks a million. Does anyone have any questions for Krisztina after that presentation? You can pop them in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up and we can do it that way. just a comment from Donna Young saying it was a great talk with excellent examples of issues with old herbarium labels. So yeah. Trevor Bailey has a question. Trevor, go ahead.
Hiya. Thanks for the talk. It was really good. I was just wondering how you go about deciding how long to spend on one of these labels that is proving to be really difficult.
Well, I work at NHM where like the lowest estimation is that we have 80 million specimens. So that's a lot of specimens to get through. When I'm doing transcriptional georeferencing, generally my guideline is 3 to 5 minutes tops. A lot of people were extensively collecting throughout their lives, and generally people tend to collect more than one specimen at the same location. So if you're going through a lot of your collections, eventually you'll find a duplicate label that was on the same day, maybe it's from the same area. So when I'm going about and I usually have a lot of very colorful spreadsheets around where I'm marking specific labels and specimens, what the problem was, if it's illegibility, if it needs translation, if there was something uncertainty. And I have a list of them keeping on the side. Sometimes going back to it because a fresh pair of eyes can really help you out. We have the spreadsheets usually for transcription collection, transcription and georeferencing, where we are sharing it with our entire team. So if you have a trouble with the label, then your colleague might help out. We have dedicated channels as well. We are using Teams, and we have dedicated channels where if you have a problem with the label, you can just chuck it in. So that means that you don't really have to spend a lot of time on it. If my general rule is if you spend 3 to 5 minutes on one label and you couldn't figure it out, you're not going to figure it out in the next 10 minutes either. So I would just move on, maybe put it in chat for my colleagues to look at or leave it for a later time and come back to it. And most cases that we come across, it actually does happen that you're going through the entire collection from the same collector maybe, and you find like 5 more labels from the same person, sometimes with more information than the label that you originally had, or some of them with a better handwriting. Usually you can clearly see when someone got tired writing down the same the place name on multiple labels again and again, especially before you could like mass print your labels. So I think it's really human to just maybe write down properly the site that you're searching in the first couple of times, and eventually you start shortening the words, excluding words. So to have a nice set of collection of labels will guide you through more problematic ones. I think sometimes it's as well like luck. We have a couple of collectors that was troubling one of the botanical curator for a while because he's seen specimens from a particular collector, but we have no records of ever receiving his collection. So he really had no idea how it ended up in a herbarium. And we found one specimen that was having an extra information on it that there was a French doctor who just sent a bunch of specimens to North America to another collector as a kind of like an exchange. And we received the collection and the herbarium of that person from North America, and that's how that particular set of specimen ended up in our herbarium. But that was purely of luck, like seeing one like sentence written on the back of one herbarium sheet. So
wow, that's amazing.
It's really luck sometimes.
Yeah. We have a ton of questions coming in there. Louise from the team at NHM is answering some of them about pre-World War I maps. So if anyone's wondering about that, check out the chat. There's answers there and some links to follow. There's a question here from or Pernille, asking, as an initial approach to recording historic collections, is it best to put the label text in the description and then make the georeferencing a separate project? They're from they're from a small organization with limited resources. Do you have any recommendations there about whether the georeferencing and the label data should be separate issue?
So there is many ways to go about, and what we found the most useful and the quickest is to have kind of like the list of modern day countries with you from like the ISO list, which has like the set of like, I think it's 195 at the moment. It's approximately, I think. And when you go about in your collection for initial one, when you do the transcription, because that's where the knowledge and the information is most in your brain, just add kind of like a master country designation without georeferencing very precisely, because that will also make your collection more searchable. So if you have country designation and if you're putting out your digitized specimens, maybe someone will contact you like, hey, I can see that you have 50 specimens from this particular country. I'm an expert who is doing research. Can I just go and look at? And maybe that person can just do the georeferencing for you, and you don't have to spend additional resources in trying to resource, especially if it's like a very obscure place. And we are also, when we are digitizing, for example, a slide collection, our workflow includes just quickly adding master, like the modern country names to them. When I was going through the herbarium collection, I did the same as well, because we had 12,000 specimens to be transcribed, and I was doing it alone. So the easiest was just have the list of like the countries, so I can just add countries to it. So it's not very detailed georeferencing, but at least you have something. And based on that, you can plan better a future project maybe for georeferencing when you are specifically asking your team or particular members who wants to be in the project, like, do you have an expertise from a particular country that you're familiar with? Maybe you're working with a lot of people from various different countries, and they can just take on like georeferencing those particular countries. Yeah, I'm usually very happy to just like any curator or someone contacting me, like any Hungarian place names, because it's a mess, and I'm very familiar with that. It's a very scary language for people who don't speak it, with a lot of diacritic marks. So
yeah, definitely using people to your advantage, I'd say, who are from the place is definitely a thing. And we have a couple here from Christopher Kreutzer. He thanks you for the talk. And the first question is, do you have any advice on local or country-specific grids and georeferencing system? How easy is it to recognize them? And are there ways to look that up?
For country-specific grids, you have resources. So we have the grid reference tool for UK and pretty much the British Isles. I'm familiar with that. For example, there is a grid reference finder for South Africa as well, because I used it extensively. I might have not included it in the resources, but I'm happy to go and find it because I was using it a lot. Other than this, sometimes it's easier to find and sometimes it's not that. I think it really depends on how available the resources are. And unfortunately, it's also depending on like how open that country is to share information about their country's details. So unfortunately, modern politics affects a lot of resource availability. Unfortunately, which is like in terms of like researching as well, because of the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. I'm from the UK, and the moment it kind of started, like loads of Russian sites were unavailable immediately. Which I don't know if it was blocked because of my IP address or something. But this is a very, very true case. There is a lot of Chinese websites as well that could be very handy tool for you for Chinese locations, and they are not available if you are trying to access them from outside China. So I believe there is quite a few countries that would hinder your resources, and if you are not from that particular country geographically.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
You can build good relationships and ask for extra resources from
colleagues, based somewhere.
Yes.
That is probably the best thing. He's saying as well, are there standard ways or standardized, I guess, ways to document sources in collection management systems so that future researchers can check the same documents you did, like if they want to go back and make sure that what you wrote, I guess, is correct?
So when I'm georeferencing, I'm always
like, do you reference the source?
Sorry?
You always include a source,
Yeah, so when I'm georeferencing, I'm always including my source. If it was if it's not something that I can just Google, like, give me the coordinates for London or Paris or something like that, if it's an obscure location that I had to dig up, I always include my source.
Yeah.
And at NEJM, we have very sad georeferencing guideline that if your label is in a format of this, what to do this, which Malcolm will talk about in more details in his presentations with the set guidelines. So it's best that you have set guidelines. GBIF has a very good georeferencing set of guidelines. You can use Darwin Core for formatting your data set, which is also helping you how to go about, which is an internationally accepted system. There is a new system as well, Latimer Core, which is aiming to kind of have a description in a set format about your entire collection and its history. So what's the provenance of your collection, which can be very useful as well for researchers.
Thanks. Let me see.
And one little note that I just recently discovered, that if you have a very obscure website as your resource, put it in the Wayback Machine in Internet Archive, because I recently found 2 of my resources are not available anymore. So now I'm just going immediately to the Wayback Machine and saving a page of that resource for.
Yeah, that is the worst.
Yes, yes.
As a data manager. Yeah, we our collection management system does allow you to attribute, and I'll cover that when I talk. But the other thing, there's one other way, like if you actually have a document and you want to save that in a collection management system, there's one other thing you have to worry about is intellectual property. So I've had people wanting to put actually attach the multimedia into our collection management system, and we have to check with the IP officer and go, are we actually breaching intellectual property if we hold that in our own system? But our particular collection management system allows various levels of attribution and source citing. For the most part, we just kind of have a drop-down list that says Google Maps or something else. So usually it's just as simple as that. But if it's more complicated and you actually have like a document that is an old map, you have to check if you've got the rights to store it. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see. We have one here from Rachel, who asks, is there a good way to deal with place names written phonetically by an English collector in a language they're not familiar with? It's a problem she comes across all the time.
This is my particular niche. So one of my favorite things is to dealing with orthographic transcription in collections. Orthographic transcription is where you are writing down phonetically in your language a name of another site or some person's name, which is very common in our collections as well. And usually a very good thing is for a particular thing is to know what the mother tongue was of your collector, which will help you guide it to a certain direction. And it also the age. For example, with Chinese collections, we have a very good set of information when the current pinyin system was developed and introduced, and very good systems, what other systems were used before that. So for example, for the if your collector was French native, the IFIO transliteration system is the go-to guide. If your collector was 20th century American, then we have the Yale transliteration system that was specifically developed for American soldiers, for China. We have the Wade Giles, which is most commonly used before the pinyin system for Anglophones. So there is a couple of systems available as well. And sometimes you can go about and get very, very niche books. So yeah, it's blurring it, but this is a set of 2 books, which is a guide to transliterated Chinese in the modern Peking dialect. And modern is loose words here because the book were published in the 60s. So, but these days we have the unified pinyin, for example, for Chinese. But these books are containing, I don't know how much it's visible, I can link the books, but it's pages and pages of tables, including which transliteration system and what's going to be the pinyin equivalent of it. So for Chinese, we have these, and for other systems as well. And a little bit of a sneaky one, but sometimes I'm just looking at the label and saying the name out in, like, if my collector was French native, I would just say it out with a French accent. If they were German, with a German accent. And it's usually, you can hear out which city or big place they meant by.
Yeah.
And obviously, this is not going to help you with very obscure locations. But when I was working with a lot of Chinese data, I started noting down if it's from this collector and he's using these words, because I had big city names because they were collected in place names that are still exist today. So I would write those down and I write down what their spelling was. And based on that, I could kind of determine what other place names, if they are spelled it like this, then you can kind of determine that what the pinyin version would be today.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can find early ones. One of my favorite one is, I think it's maybe 18th century book, but it was written by French missionaries writing down the French phonetic for Chinese place names, but they were also including the Chinese characters. So you can just go by and find those. It's fascinating. I absolutely loving that book. But yeah, you can be a little bit sneaky and try to say out the word with a fake accent, and if it rings a bell.
Very good. Patrick Roycroft has a question about a spreadsheet. I'm wondering, Patrick, could you unmute yourself and explain your question?
I think he was mentioning my colorful spreadsheet.
Your colorful spreadsheet. Okay, he's saying, do you have an example of that type of spreadsheet to show us?
I might. I'm screen sharing, right? So if I go and just drag a spreadsheet, maybe I can. Which
I think that should work.
Okay, so I just let me whip up the one that I was working on the latest. Yeah, I had to think about which one is the one that I'm allowed to share. That's like we finished and everything. And I think there is a project which is mostly on our data portal available. So it's I'm not sharing anything that is not available. So this is it visible?
We're still seeing your PowerPoint window.
But is it the PowerPoint
or PowerPoint? Yeah, sorry, we're still seeing the PowerPoint. It's not full screen, but we can see the
screen sharing. Oh, I know what happened. Okay, so I can do a visiting. So now?
Yep.
So you can see that we have a README of like a little bit of guidance for it. And we also have like specific tabs. The project was broken down into smaller sections. So like the British is separate. I'm also highlighting in colors when it's done, with orange if I'm working on it, or no color if I'm still working on it. And you can see like kind of like, I think the best one is this one, which I just take out the filter and it should, yeah, so very colorful. The background is yellow because if it's white, it's just hurting my eyes. But other than this, green ones that is updated, like it's ready for the curator to check, or it's already in our CMS, in our collection management system. If I have these red lines, that means that I'm uncertain of the transcription. And I usually have an issues column where I'm indicating what my issue was. So it's illegible the collector, illegible the locality. Sometimes I'm adding in details if I know what the problem is and why. Like, so current sorry, I'm not German, current schrift. German is not one of those languages I'm very confident with. So that's a particular handwriting system with the letters looking very different from the modern version, and I'm not familiar with it. So these ones I would just leave out and possibly send it to our curator who is German native and he is familiar, or I have a friend who is fluent in current schrift, so I'm sending them. This is one of the things that so you can see other errors like the image got corrupted and it's not in the system. So I'm just highlighting this one as well, like Gothic German. This is just, I need some time. So that it's the black letter version of the German. Some of them I have like it's Russian, so I need to spend more time on it. So there is a couple, label is very faded. So it's more of an issue that it's not that I can't read the label or I'm not familiar with the language. So this is usually I work with many columns as well, indicating different things as well. So here as well, I have the red ones where I'm uncertain, or either the location or the person's name. Or sometimes when I can't designate a country here, I have what the problem is. So you can see I have a lot of Turkestan one that I mentioned in my presentation, and it's just on the border, and I can't narrow it down further than that.
Yeah, yeah. That's an amazing spreadsheet. Someone just on that has asked, are you entering the data directly into Excel or a database program?
It really depends on the collection I'm working with. So, and sometimes it's determined by the projects that you're working in. So we have a lot of projects at NHM that are either internally funded or externally funded. And sometimes we have requests from, so we have a lot of projects with open access projects, which multiple institutes works together. So we had a project where it was Q Edinburgh and us. There was a project where we were working with some other institutes as well, where you all have create data sets and then you are sending the data sets to the requester. So in those situations, it's easier to do it into a spreadsheet because that you can just send it to the researcher who requested the data, and then you can fiddle around with settings and formatting to import it into your internal system. So,
there's a couple of questions we haven't got to, but we're running a little bit over time. So we are going to have a kind of practical session and a general discussion towards the end of the day. So
yes.
If people want to hold on to their questions and make note of them and ask them, then I would recommend doing that. It's 11 minutes past 11. I am going to suggest that we break and come back at 25 minutes past 11 and start on the next talk, which is Malcolm's talk next.
Yeah. Just for the lot of questions, like the entire afternoon session was designed to have a discussion, so we can have more detailed discussions in the afternoon.
Perfect. Thanks a million. Okay, thanks everyone. See you shortly.